Enigma depravatio est. Enigma crudelitas est.
Welcome back, my fellow seekers. I had a chance to visit a Native American mound in Arkansas as I was visiting one of my Alita Army friends named John for the first time. We stopped by at Toltec Mounds. As a landscape designer, I am fascinated with these ancient landscape sites. I think there is more to these sites than just a pile of dirt that looks like boobs sticking out of the ground, as my Alita Army friend might say. As I was running up the mound to get some footage before I get caught, it made me appreciate the amount of work that was put into these mounds across the Mississippian Empire culture of North Atlantica. I believe the New World is the lost continent of the Atlantis story, with oceans on either side. And the original capital city of Atlantis is in Egypt, as I explained in my other videos. The Native Americans may have a biblical connection to Atlantis, making them the Neo-Atlanteans, with the new capital being in Central America, with the legend of El Dorado at El Mirador, and Toltec is just one remnant of those lost civilizations in the lost continent that the Egyptians foretold. The site is on the banks of the Mound Lake, an oxbow lake of the Arkansas River. It was occupied by its original inhabitants as late as 600 CE, but was completely abandoned by 1050 CE. But it's also possible that this could date as far back as 3500 BC, the supposed start of the Mississippian mound culture. The identification of the site with the Toltec of Mexico was promoted in the 19th century by Mr. Gilbert Knapp, owner of the land from 1857 to 1900, who believed that Toltecs had built the mounds. Investigations at the site by archaeologist Edward Palmer from the Smithsonian Institute of Bureau of American Ethnology in 1883 and others since have proven that the indigenous ancestors of the region of Native North America had built these mounds and all other mounds up to the present day. They were part of the mound building cultures that flourished within the late Archaic period into the prehistoric period. Now it does seem reasonable to believe that there could be a connection with the Toltec period in Mexico around 700 CE, but I think the Mississippian cultures are older than the Toltec Empire, who are simply a later version of a much older culture that came out of Central America, and maybe some migrated into North America, giving birth to the Mississippian mound cultures around 3500 BC. Much of the knowledge of architecture and other knowledges like agriculture may have been dispersed from the real El Dorado at El Mirador, being the Neo-Atlanteans. But naturally over time cultures change as they claim new lands and assimilate with the natives of the land. So Mr. Gilbert may be wrong that there was a connection to the Toltec period in Mexico, but isn't wrong to think that there may be a connection to Central Atlantica that spread north and south to give birth to the cultures of the Americas. The Toltec culture, also known as the Plum Bayou culture in reference to the local waterways which were used as highways. Now this doesn't mean that they were distinct cultures separate from the other Mississippian cultures. They all extend from the same family root of Cahokia, but with different feudal-like dynastic lords, but all paid tribute to Cahokia through trade as the capital of the Mississippian Empire that could have rivaled the Mayans. But they eventually fractured like all empires. The people lived in permanent villages and hamlets throughout the countryside, with Toltec being the fortress-like town enclosure with a berm and possibly a fence. They built sturdy thatched houses within the berm and farm outside the town of a couple thousand people. Those within the berm were the higher status people made up primarily of political and religious leaders of the community and their families. Those outside the town were the farmers who paid tax to feed the town. More than likely, it's a similar system to what we see in feudal Japan during its mound building culture of the Kofun period. The archaeological site once had a 10-foot high and 1 mile long earth embankment ditch on 3 sides. At one time, this was used as a canal or a moat around the town that connected to the lake as a trading port. 18 mounds were built inside the high curving 1 mile embankment. 2 of the mounds were at least 50 feet high back in the day until burrowing animals and people started to erode the mound down to 38 feet tall. Mounds were placed along the edge of the 2 open plazas, which were used for political and religious and social activities attended by the people in the vicinity. At least 2 mounds were used for feasting, as indicated by discarded food remains. Deer and fish were of favorite food. The mound placement seemed to have been planned using a principle based on the alignment with important solar positions and standardized units of measurement. Most of the mounds were flat-topped platform mounds with buildings on top of them where the leadership gathered. The mounds were more than likely rebuilt a couple times to place new bodies inside the mounds, with the older bodies being not in the center of the mound but below the mound's base, in a limestone chamber. The mound was layered with different materials to maintain a steep slope, similar to what we see with the Mystery Stone Chambers of New England, so these chambers could be 15 feet below the base of the mound, similar to the Goshen Mystery Tunnel in Goshen, Massachusetts. I have actually visited some of the Mystery Stone walls of New England. I'll leave a link below. If there is a chamber in these two mounds, more than likely they're underwater now. Other Native Americans lived on the site in the 15th century, but they did not build the mounds. Instead, a lot of their history was lost to them. At one point, all the Mississippian cultures could have spoken one language, but with different dialects, but that eventually diverged away from each other. Due to the vastness of North America, it was hard to keep the cultures unified, especially when the rivers flow one direction, and building trails northward required a lot of maintenance, just as mountain biking trails require a lot of maintenance today. Control of these trails and waterways created geopolitical tensions that led to the fracturing of the Mississippian Empire. The Plum Bayou culture did have some unique ceramics. Much of the Plum Bayou ceramic was plainware tempered with shells. A red clay paint was used to decorate some of the ceramic vessels that was used for food. Also, now it's understood that the Mississippian cultures did wear quite sophisticated clothing and shoes from animal skins. They dressed to protect themselves from the elements and to show modesty. They didn't just walk around naked, although they may have dressed in ways that made themselves more attractive. But more than likely, those living in the town would have better clothing. Also, their boats varied in size to transport goods upstream, with possible animal skins used as sails. And when it comes to the construction of the mounds, there must have been a lead designer managing the work. Now, baskets were used to place the soil, rock, and grass in a layering, precise manner at the Pacific site. But where all that material came from is kind of a mystery, and the tools would have been large stone flat axe heads. I think it's likely that some of the soil was dumped in large canoes from upstream to downstream miles away, and wooden sleds with ropes were used to transport it to its final destination, instead of just using thousands of baskets and trying to move all that soil from point A to point B. Sleds would have been far more efficient than actually using a wheel at the time. Even the Egyptians used the sled technique. If there is a stone chamber, then sleds would have been used to move the limestone blocks at the site. And it could be possible that some domestication of deer or elk were used to pull these wooden sleds. If they did not maintain the domestication, then these animals would go back to being wild after the collapse of the Mississippian Empire, which could explain why we don't see hardly any evidence of domestication. So I think the Mississippian cultures were more sophisticated than we first thought, especially if they were born from the Central American cultures over 3000 BC. And I also think there might be a biblical connection to the Mississippians with the legends of giants. And one of these mounds may harbor a Nephilim giant. Now, when I say giants, I don't mean 30-foot tall humans, but possibly simply just an abnormal mutant humans that grew between 8 to 10 feet tall. This is far more plausible and would be enough to spark exaggerated legends on giants that also was incorporating supernatural elements, such as conflating the human giants with the cryptoid eyewitness claims, such as the legends of the Wendigo, which are simply demonic manifestations that are very rare. It's no different than the Bigfoot cases and the Dogman sightings. They are all just demonic limited manifestations of the poltergeist phenomenon, also known as jinns, and nowadays we call them UFOs. So they morph and change into shape and all that depending on the circumstance of the location and the person's psyche and the person they're trying to latch onto. So the Native Americans are more than likely conflating the actual humanoid giants with supernatural manifestations, and that's where the legends are kind of overlapping. So you gotta separate those stories out. So the legends of giants may also be conflating with the cryptoid demonic phenomenon. But these are different events. There are the cryptoid phenomenon, but there may also have been an actual biological humanoid race of giants that were pretty much normal humans except they were taller and may have higher intellect. but more than likely this mutant-like human race was a small number, but had a big impact on the cultures around the world until they died off. Some Native American legends tell that the Native Americans themselves killed off the last remaining giants in war, but it's also possible that some tribes saw them as demigods and built mounds for them, and others saw them as cannibals who required human sacrifice. So the Native Americans rebelled against their giant overlords. This is really the only photo evidence of the claims, with the cases coming out of Wisconsin reported in May 4th of 1912 by the New York Times. And I do believe it's possible that the Smithsonian at the time really was trying to cover up some of these giants, and more than likely it's actually the Native Americans themselves that probably covered up most of the evidence, destroyed the bones, had warfare, these humans, and there were just a small number of them, so it would probably been pretty easy to almost wipe out all the evidence. It's possible these type of humans were the real megafauna humanoids of the Ice Age, but also died off the rest of the megafauna. But their numbers were a lot smaller if they were born from humans but through a supernatural mutation intervention thousands of years ago. Keep in mind the origins of speech was also caused by a mutation over 70,000 years ago, so we were not really fully human until that event. It's possible that another mutation happened later, but this time it was a violation of God's natural law by the angels, so the evidence had to be destroyed through a great flood and through warfare, and the humans eventually took over. The Native Americans call these giants the Eas. Now I understand of the genetic disease of gigantism, so those with the disease are not the original giants, but it's possible that the disease is a remnant within the junk DNA that is malfunctioning due to natural laws suppressing the genes for the healthy giant genetic inheritance, in order to prevent two intelligent human species emerging on the planet, competing with each other. So God may have only wanted one type of human species to come out of the Ice Age, but the demonic and lower angels wanted more than one intelligent human species on the planet. So in other words, the lower angels were cheating the evolutionary process by causing mutations to give birth to a new super race, and they may have almost succeeded until God had to step in, knowing that these giants were growing in their pride to the point of enslaving and even eating humans. Although God may have caused the mutation that gave birth to the ability of language, it still required the evolutionary process over tens of thousands of years, whereas the lower angels wanted to just speed up the process and pretty much add some more bells and whistles to the human species, to the point that some of these angels wanted to use these human giants as avatars to manifest in a biological form like Jesus. I know this sounds far-fetched, but as someone who's personally experienced a supernatural phenomenon, I'm not ruling out the possibility that something like this may have happened. But these supernatural interventions can be very subtle to the point that we can't distinguish what's natural and what's supernatural. We won't know for sure until the bones of these Atlantean giants emerge again, but maybe it's for the best that they don't. This has been Enigma Seeker. Keep seeking those enigmas.